Hi, please join me, Terry McCosker, as we look at soil carbon, the carbon cycle, and the science of soil carbon sequestration.
Soil carbon, what is it and where's it come from? In our last session we looked at wealth transfer from the rural landscapes over the last couple of centuries and the need to get some of that transferred back from the urban landscapes to the rural landscapes over the next century. And soil carbon trading is one way to achieve that. If we look at the carbon cycle, it's the process of birth, growth, reproduction, death and decay. We hear a lot about CO2 these days. And during the process of birth, growth and reproduction, carbon is removed from CO2 in the atmosphere and goes into every living thing. And during the processes of death and decay, that carbon molecule leaves every living thing as it dies and goes back to the atmosphere as CO2. So we've got this cycle that in all biological systems is continuous. Let's have a look at where carbon actually is in the whole biosphere. So in the atmosphere we've got around about 800 gigatons of carbon. In all the vegetation on Earth we've got around about 610 gigatons. In the soils, around about 1,580 gigatons, and some estimates are 2,000 gigatons in the top metre of soil. There's around about 1,000 gigatons in the surface of the ocean, about 4,000 gigatons stored in fossil fuels, and we emit around about 5 to 8 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. So if we look at that total equation, it's not very difficult to see how soils could remove, for a storage of around about 2,000 gigatons, could remove 5 to 8 gigatons a year from the atmosphere, and perhaps even more than that, and remove some of the legacy load. Now we can sequester carbon in two places over which we have some control. The first of those is soil carbon, and in the left-hand slide you'll see a slight dark colouring beneath the surface of the soil, and that is soil carbon. And in the middle there you'll see a plant which is a different species, and the soil carbon goes down much deeper and comes back up again as we move into the other species. And that carbon is right down at about 3 or so feet down into the soil profile. The second place that we can store carbon, obviously, and the one that most people know about, is actually in trees. However, the problem with trees is if we covered the earth in trees, we wouldn't have a great deal to eat at the end of the day. So soil carbon is a potential solution for the world while we maintain agricultural production. So why would we use soil instead of trees? Firstly, we can continue with food production. We can increase the water holding capacity of soils, making soils more drought resilient. We can mitigate floods by decreasing runoff. We can increase biodiversity above and below ground. We increase mineral cycling and storage. We increase food quality. We increase agricultural production, and we remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So when you look at soil carbon, it ticks absolutely every box, and it's a win-win in every direction that you look at. So how does it get into the soil? The process that most people know about is decomposition. And decomposition is where you take organic matter, which is then broken down by soil microbial activity into soil organic carbon. But the other way in which it gets there is through sequestration. And sequestration is the process of, during photosynthesis, of plants producing sugar, taking a fair proportion of that sugar every day down into the root system and exuding it out into the soil. The plant does that to feed the soil microbes. The soil microbes then feed the plant with various nutrients, including water. So what we're looking at is being able to develop the root systems of our plants. If we have larger root systems, greater volume of root systems, we'll have more organic matter in the soil and therefore more organic carbon. Secondly, if the plant is much more vigorous on top, it's going to produce a lot more sugar, and we'll have a lot more sugar which contains carbon exuded into the soil profile itself. When it gets into the soil, the major contributor to stabilising soil carbon are the mycorrhizal fungi. And you'll see the dark coloration there of the root, and the white colour are the mycorrhizal fungi attached to the roots. Now those roots there are root hairs, which are microscopic, and the mycorrhizal fungi are also microscopic. Now one of the things that mycorrhizal fungi do is produce a substance called glomalin, which is very high in carbon and is the first stage of stabilising carbon in the soil. But there's another group of fungi called melanitic fungi, which also increase organic carbon in the soil. And the melanitic fungi is one that actually stabilises it in the soil. And you'll see in this particular experiment, where there was plants without the melanitic fungi, organic carbon was 6.7% in the soil. But where the melanitic fungi was applied, it was 7.9% in the soil, and that's a massive increase in soil carbon, which occurred in only 14 weeks, and that is in fact a staggering result. When we add carbon to the soil, it goes in a couple of forms in plants and roots, and what's called new carbon. So there's old plants and roots, and there's obviously new plants and roots and carbon within the soil microbial activity. And what this graph here is showing is that the higher the organic matter content of the soil becomes, the greater the sequestration of new carbon in plants and roots. The cause of that is an increase in fungi. And as the new canopy and root carbon increases in the soil, so too does the fungal bacteria ratio. And a few results from Queensland and New South Wales in Australia indicate that where we've compared cell graze properties to neighbours, where the cell graze properties have been grazed effectively for 10 years or more, we find a useful change in the soil carbon content. And in fact, the average of all of those sites, and which were incidentally sampled during a drought, the average change in soil organic carbon is 0.4% over 10 years, which doesn't sound like a lot, but economically it's a significant amount. The problem for agriculture when it comes to carbon trading is that the Kyoto system is based on a linear approach to carbon. That is, we take carbon out of the soil, we put it through some sort of machinery, and we pump some CO2 into the atmosphere. When we move into biological systems, the carbon is cyclical. In other words, it operates in a carbon cycle. And so far, it's very difficult to effectively fit a carbon cycle, biological system, into a linear approach to the whole carbon situation. However, that's something for the future, and we will continue on and talk a lot more about how we measure soil carbon and what we can do with it over time.